investigate the injuries that cause horses to retire, and we would find the risk factors and reduce them. But the journey it's taken me on has been fascinating.
Well, that's brilliant. I know we've talked a little bit about this, but I'm looking forward to seeing a much deeper talk on it tonight. So I'll let you begin.
Excellent. So as I said, I'm going to be doing 2 presentations tonight. The first presentation will be looking at what occurs for thoroughbreds between birth and when they enter training and racing. And the second one will be looking at basically a snapshot of a single racing season and looking at what happens as they are leaving the racing industry. So our first group tonight, if I can get the thing to progress. There we go. Our first project is the Birth to Racing project. The aims of this study were to describe the population and the highest level of training for horses that had not entered training prior to 4 years of age, which for this group was the 17-18 racing season. We wanted to identify the outcomes for those horses that hadn't trained and the reasons why they had that outcome, as well as the ages in which the outcomes occurred. We'll take a moment to note that the outcomes in this group occurred prior to the implementation of rules looking at improving traceability in horses prior to racing in 2016. So there were a little over 13,000 horses born in the 2014 foal crop. Prior to 4 years of age, 66% of the foal crop had entered training and a little over half had raced. Of the 34% that had not entered training, 5% were exported, and the remaining horses encompass our study population. Those were the horses that remained in Australia that hadn't entered training prior to 4 years of age. A bit of additional information is that 2% of the foal crop were exported after training and racing. The majority of the foal crop were born in New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland. So about 45% in New South Wales. Victoria had just under a quarter and about 15% in Queensland. One of the things I found really interesting about this project was the breeders. I suppose I mainly was involved in the racing industry, much like Charvain used to be, and the limited awareness I had of the breeders was mainly with stud farms and your larger farms. It was interesting for me to find out, looking at the data, that we had, just under 4,500 breeders, and that the majority of breeders had 3 or fewer foals that were registered to them. In fact, the more than 50% of the breeders had just 1 foal. So most of the breeders were smaller operations. So when we wanted to look at those, in order to do our survey, we wanted to take a sample of those 3,800 horses and investigate those quite deeply, but we didn't have a lot of racing records, or we didn't have any racing records because they hadn't trained or raced. So the approach we took was that we took a sample of the entire 13,000 horses born in the foal crop, and that sample gave us about 4,000 horses. And then we used a 2-level validation. So the horses were selected on the postcode in which they were born. And as you can see on the map here, it's the red dots are the ones that were sampled, and the black dots are the ones that weren't, and the red dots are sitting over the top of the black dots. So you can see that we have a very good representative, like a spatial representative sample that we've taken. And then what we did is we then looked at the activity levels for those horses in the sample, and we're just interested in the horses that had not entered training. And that was there was 1,275 horses that were eligible to be surveyed that had not entered training. We've sent the survey out and we got about 50% response rate. Now, just to give you a bit of context, most surveys return about 30% is considered a good response rate. So we were very happy to have our 50% response rate. We looked at the outcomes for these horses. The biggest barrier to horses transitioning from the stud farm to the racetrack was that they were deceased. The majority of these deaths occurred in the first year of life, with the period of risk increasing with the younger age of the horse. So as horses, the first month was the greatest period of risk for death, and as they got older, the risk decreased. Interestingly, 8% of horses that were deceased died during unofficial training. This suggests that we're not, at that point in time, we weren't capturing those horses very well in those early stages or those younger horses at training. The most frequent reason for death was fracture, followed by congenital malformation, sudden death, which was usually attributed to snakebite, and infections and wounds and trauma were even at 6%. Now, I've got a little star here by congenital malformation. The survey respondents used this when looking at the detail of what they had provided. They tended to group conformational defects in this category. And whilst most conformational defects are not true congenital malformations, so congenital malformation is something that's present from birth, some conformational defects can be acquired. We've left them in there just because it would be inappropriate to change the responses. But just be aware that congenital malformation can include conformational defects. Importantly, 92% of deaths were not associated with any form of training. Our next group is the horses that were participating in racing at 4 years of age. So if you remember, we were looking at those horses that hadn't entered training, and these were so about 24% of survey respondents then entered training at 4 years of age, and the majority of those were actively participating in racing and training. We had 13% of horses that were identified as going to a sale. The majority of the horses in this category were proactive decisions to breed or to sell, excuse me. And the majority of these were sold at industry sales as either yearlings or weanlings. The respondents in this group were unable to provide us with information about what happened to those horses after they went through those sales. 16% of survey outcomes were horses that were retired or rehomed. The majority of these, the vast majority of these horses were rehomed outside the thoroughbred industry, with about 17% undertaking stud book activities. The most frequent injury associated with retirement was tendon and ligament injuries. And again, congenital malformation or conformation faults accounted for, that was the second most frequent. The most frequent age for retirement was 1 year of age, or was 3 years of age, pardon me. Our last category we're going to talk about is this other category, which these were horses that were intending to race. So they hadn't raced as a 4-year-old, but they were intending to race them in the future. With the reasons given for them not racing prior to the survey was both personal and financial reasons, giving the horse time to mature, or the horse had experienced an injury when it was younger, and they felt it would be suitable to race once it recovered. So what does this mean for the overall foal crop? We've taken those survey responses and extrapolated them to our study population and have been able to provide an estimate of what is occurring across the entire foal crop. So what we could expect from the overall foal crop is that 11% of horses are deceased prior to entering training. 6% of the foal crop will die in the first year of life. 7% of the foal crop will enter training at 4 years of age, with a further 1% potentially entering training after that. We had 4% that retired or were rehomed, and 4% that were sold prior to entering training. So the take-home messages from this study was that the survey estimates that 20% of the foal crop will not enter training in their lives. 15% of the foal crop will be unavailable to enter training or racing due to either death or retirement and rehoming. Injury is the most frequent reason preventing them from making that transition, but the majority of those injuries are not associated with training. The first year of life is the greatest risk of death. There was some challenges with traceability at point of sale. And for me, this sort of brings home that the number of horses that are born and reported as the foal crop is not the number that are available for racing. And that's important when we apply percentages to the published foal crop number. We also have a large number of smaller breeders and these need to be taken into account when we make policy changes that are involving breeders and the foal, influencing the foal crop. And there are these policies can impact the sustainability of racing in the future. We've had a decreasing foal crop with the exception of the slight bump in 2016. And we want to ensure that future policies are based on data and not perception, and that we don't have any unintended consequences. I'd like to thank my co-investigators and AgriFutures, and I'm happy to take questions. All right, so this is the second group. So as I said at the beginning, we had two cohorts. There was actually three. There was my PhD group as well. But this is the second national group. So the 2014s looked at what happened up to 4 years of age. We have my little Victorian group in the middle that looked at horses from birth to 10 years of age. This is looking at a snapshot of a single racing season and trying to understand what is going on in a single racing season. Yes, the aims of the study are to describe the population of horses that are training and racing in the 2017-18 racing season. And again, we're looking to identify the outcomes for horses that exited and the reason for and ages at which those outcomes occurred. So concentrate on the top part of the flowchart here. Our source population is the horses that were active in that racing season, and there are about 37,704 horses. If you have ever read the Racing Australia Fact Book, you'll know that that's more horses than are normally racing each year. So on average, there's about 28,000 horses that race each year. And for this particular group, there were about 9,000 that were only training in that season. The status boxes you see below that are the stable return status at the end of the 2017-18 racing season. A stable return is a form that the trainer submits to the principal racing authority in each state, notifying the PRA of the status of that horse, and that whether it's come into its stable or if it has left its stable, the reasons why it's left. You'll note that underneath the active, we have potentially exiting. We wanted to do a bit of investigation about the currency of the stable return system. So horses in this category are horses that had an active status, but they hadn't had a trial or a race or a stable return in the last 6 months of the 17-18 racing season. And our primary focus, much like the other one, is these inactive horses, the long blue box. So we went through a similar sampling process from the entire population, the 37,000 horses, and that returned a sample of 5,149 horses. Again, we did our dual validation, mainly just to make sure that we had a good spread of our activity status. So the postcode for this study was the postcode of the last registered trainer for the horse. And again, you can see the distribution. This one was done a little bit different because it was done by their PhD student. I actually think this is probably a better better map, in that the size of the dot is relative to the size of the population that sits underneath it. And you can see the black dots underlying the red, whereas before they were covered up by the multiple little dots. Yeah, so we were only interested in inactive horses, so the potentially exiting horses or those that were deceased, retired, active non-stable training, spelling, or transferred were all of our inactive horses. So there were 2,500 horses from the sample that were eligible to get a survey, and we sent that survey to the trainers of those horses, and we had 1,750 responses. So just as a reminder, the normal response rate for a survey is about 30%. We are more than double that. So it does sort of show the engagement that the industry has in this, and the trainers were very willing to give us their responses. Looking through the outcomes, the most frequent outcome for horses that were inactive at the end of the 2017-18 racing season was that they were retired or rehomed. The majority of those horses were rehomed outside the thoroughbred industry, and we had a median age of retirement of 5 years. And if you remember the median, so that means that horses that were retired, half of them were 5 years of age and less, and half of them were 5 years of age and over. This median age of retirement is consistent with the 1,600 horses from the Victorian foal crop that had trained and raced. It is consistent with the industry records for the 2005 and 2010 Victorian foal crops that had their last race start at 5 years as well. The reasons for retirement were predominantly voluntary, with 29% that left due to injury. Again, this is similar to the results for the Victorian study. And then the reasons, these voluntary reasons for retirement were primarily poor performance and owner requests. So the reasons you see on the bottom of the screen are the ones that the trainers get that have available to them on their stable returns. So we wanted something that they were familiar with. Interestingly, when we looked at the detail of this poor performance and owner request, there were lots of similarities in the responses. Things like had met its mark, was never going to win in town, lost interest in racing. Though the lost interest in racing, it was unclear whether it was the horse that lost interest, the owner, or if the trainer lost interest in racing the horse. So, but the important take-home point from this is that it was a voluntary decision to retire these horses. Of the 29% of horses that had an injury, the majority of these were musculoskeletal. The most frequent single injury that was related to retirement, similar to our foal crop group, was tendon and ligament. But it is important to note that 48% of horses that retired due to injury were undertaking ridden activities. This is echoed again by the Victorian group as well. We go back to our overall survey results. Our next category is participating in the racing industry. So these horses were inactive at the end of the 2017-18 racing season, but they returned and were participating in the racing industry the following season. The median age of these horses was younger than those that retired at 3 years of age, and the majority of them were actively training and racing. The remainder were spelling. When we look at, there were 5% that were deceased in the survey of the survey horses. Similar to the retirement, the median age of these horses was 5 years. Males were more likely to be deceased. A small proportion of these survey horses went to slaughter, though the majority of deaths occurred while exercising. And the circumstances that we classified as exercising were if the horse was participating in a race, a trial, or was undertaking pre-training or training. 90% of deaths were due to injury. The majority of those were musculoskeletal, and similar to our pre-racing horses, the 27-14 horses, fracture was the most frequent injury associated with death. When we looked at, because the survey is a cross-sectional survey, there's horses of multiple ages. So the 2014 and my Victorian group are taking a full crop and following them through a space and time, whereas this is looking at horses from multiple full crops across a very short space and time. And it was really interesting to see what the results were for each category when we looked at the different ages that they were within that season. As you can see with the light blue, as the horse age increases, the percentage of that group that are participating in racing decreases. Conversely, as age increases, retirement, which is our dark blue, is increasing. It's important to note that the percentage of horses that are deceased in each age group is relatively consistent and between 3 and 9%. So again, we get back to, but what does this mean for the population? So we went through a similar process of taking the survey results and extrapolating it into the inactive horses in the for the population, and we were able to provide estimates from the total population from all 37,000 horses of what's occurring in these horses at the end of the racing season. So 12% were rehomed, are likely to be homed outside of the thoroughbred industry. 5% are undertaking stud book activities or other industry roles, such as lead pony or clerk of the course horses. 2% were deceased. Importantly, 15% were participating in racing the following season, with the 2% be, exported, sold, or returned to owner. How does this compare to industry records? Well, we look, in our flowchart, we have the broad spread of the survey outcomes. We've then looked at this stable returns, pardon me. We've then looked at the stable returns across the age groups, similar to the survey horses. Now, it's important to note that, the majority of horses are active. So for every age group, the largest category are horses that are active. The largest percentage in each age group is active horses. Though we see horses that are retired increasing with age, much like our survey results. And importantly, your rate of deceased horses on stable returns, again, is relatively consistent by each age group between 0 and 3% of the total population. So again, the take-home messages from this survey is that the survey agrees with previous research done by Thompson that 36% of horses are inactive or exiting a racing stable at the end of the season. But what is really important is that 15% are coming back into the racing industry the following season. They're not just leaving and going. When we look at horses that are permanently leaving, about 19% of the racing population are permanently leaving each season. What this means in terms of horses is about 4,500 horses will be rehomed outside the thoroughbred industry each year, and about 1,800 will be retired within the industry as stud book activities or industry roles. Your mortality risk in a single season is about 2%. This is supported by industry records. And probably for me, the biggest thing is that the majority of horses are retiring at a relatively young age of 5 years for voluntary reasons. This suggests that there's an industry effect rather than, injury that is driving these retirements. This presents both challenges and opportunities for the industry. And we had, it should be noted that there's traceability challenges with horses exiting, being rehomed outside the thoroughbred industry, similarly being sold or returned to owner, for which the trainers were unable to give us further information. Current research that we have is the demographics of the racing population. It's been completed. We're currently writing the manuscript. So the aim of this is to delve deeper into the demographics and build on what is in like the Racing Australia fact book. So it's important to note that the majority of the population of racehorses reside in Victoria and New South Wales. So what we see in the fact book is more of a reflection of those two states than what's happening across the entirety of Australia. We also wanted to provide more information about the level of training and the ages for each age group, and handicap rating. We also like to look at how that compares to the race starts. If you came to the December webinar, you will have heard Tunde and Alex talking about risk factors for injury and how they had unexpected results and quite different results. Tunde's in Victoria and Alex is in Queensland. It's important to understand the differences across all levels of the horse population and race starts, including the racing service, the quality of the races, and the prize money, as all of those are risk factors for injury. There's a real opportunity for the industry to look at the state and territory populations and race starts and make headway in that holy grail, as they called it, in Alex's presentation. Our future research that we're working on at the moment is the movement of horses between states and looking at a comparison of the horse population with the race program to see where there are any mismatches that would be impacting the sustainability of the industry. So aiming to get the race program to be as efficient as possible and providing that understanding across the year so that we can utilize the horses we do have to our best ability. I'd like to thank my PhD student and my co-investigators and AgriFutures for support of this project.
Tom, welcome to the stage.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening.
No, you're more than welcome. Now, Tom, as I mentioned earlier, you're the CEO of Thoroughbred Breeders Australia and Ozhorse, and you've had a very busy time with the Thoroughbred Welfare Initiative. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And obviously, you know, we kind of all know how it came about, but what led you in your call to get this report up and running?
Sure. Well, look, I'll give some of the background around how this came about. I'm pleased to see that Dr. Dennis Napthine is one of those online this evening. For those that aren't aware, Dennis was the chair of the panel that wrote the report. So Dennis, please feel free at any point to interrupt and correct me, or if I've missed something glaringly obvious, please put me up on it. Look, for those that haven't read it, I would encourage you to do so. It's a significant document. It's about 140 pages or so. I'm going to talk a bit about how it came about, but also some of the findings in there. But you know, obviously, in the time we have, very hard to give anything but really a high-level overview of the report. Most people will know that it came about after the 730 report, which was in the spring of 2019. But by way of background, so I report to a couple of boards, as you say, Thoroughbred Breeders Australia, which is a peak body for the breeders, and Ozhorse, which is made up of some of the bigger commercial farms. Those boards have for a long time felt that welfare was probably the most important in industry issue, and the issue which, unless the industry addresses and gets right, has the most potential to really undermine the growth and strength of the Australian thoroughbred industry. So something that might not be well known is that actually before the 730, the year before the 730 report, TBA hosted a couple of workshops where we brought other groups other animal industries in to share their experiences, how they had dealt with welfare. And at the second of those groups, where we invited every principal racing authority, so those are the state bodies that run racing, we invited all of those as well as Racing Australia. And at the end of the second workshop, we put forward a proposal to actually hire some consultants, some experts to look at the thoroughbred industry and really pick apart and see where we can make improvements. Unfortunately, that proposal didn't get traction at Racing Australia board level, so that work didn't get done. And then the next year we had the 730 report. So really, I'll just give you that by way of background to sort of understand, I guess, the motivations of the TBA board and the view that they had held for a long time that this was something that was really important. The 730 report, there's, I think on the slide, there's an opportunity to watch the video, but I think anyone who has seen it probably doesn't want to see it again, and you're probably all very familiar with it, and certainly in the interest of time, we won't look at a clip. My background is as a journalist. Before taking on this job, I worked as a senior editor for Fairfax and edited a daily newspaper. I really felt that the impact of the 730 report was very significant. I think it raised a number of issues that really the industry hadn't adequately dealt with in terms of what we really knew and understood happened to our horses when they left the industry. And secondly, could we really say that we were doing all that we could to make sure that every horse that left the industry had an opportunity, had the best opportunity it could. So I think it really caused, and certainly caused us as an organisation to think about those questions. The impact of the show, obviously, as well, was particularly damaging in terms of the industry standing in broader society. And I felt that we weren't in as good a position to respond to some of the criticisms and some of the questions that were legitimately asked. So we were in a position really that we needed to improve. Days after the 730 report, TBA called for an independent group to be established to look at welfare in the thoroughbred industry, with a particular aspect of looking at horses transitioning out of the industry and horses after they've left the industry. We were very public about that, and we again met with Racing Australia and absolutely said that TBA, the breeding industry, would make significant resources available if they were willing to commission that report. Again, anyone who follows racing politics will know that finding consensus among all the PRAs is often a bit challenging. So that was a proposal that some directors were very passionate and wanted to see done, others less so. So really, the TBA's view was that this was important. If racing PRAs weren't going to do the work, then it was important. We still felt it was important to get done. So with that in mind, I suppose I reached out to a number of organisations in the racing and breeding industry to get their support, both financial support and their public support for this work. And then so I think we can move maybe to the next slide, and you'll see some of the organisations that were involved. So I approached many organisations, and everyone I spoke to essentially put their backing behind it and said they supported it. Many of them put resources in to fund the work of the panel. And really, the reaction that I got from organisations like Tabcorp or Sporting Bet, from the biggest trainers, from the biggest race clubs, all of them said there was a need for this work to get done, and they were happy to support it. So with that in mind, I reached out to the 4 panelists, reached out to a number of people to get their opinions as to who would be the best people to have on the panel. And I think we've got, if we go to the next slide, we'll see we'll see that we ended up with 4 panelists who I think had a really good range of skills. Obviously, Dennis Natfine, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, a former Premier of Victoria, also a veterinarian and a racing minister, so had great knowledge really across the whole spectrum. Dr Bidder Jones, who's now the former Chief Science and Strategy Officer at RSPCA Australia. Jack Lake, who had worked for a long time in Canberra as a special advisor on agriculture to a number of different prime ministers. And Jack, he was actually retired when the issue around exporting cattle to Indonesia, the live export issue, came up, and was called up by the then Prime Minister Julia Gillard to sit in her office and to drive the government's response to that. So someone who's very familiar with the welfare space and the ag space, and also Ken Jacobs, Dr. Ken Jacobs, who I'm sure many of you will be aware of, but a former director of the Australian Veterinary Association, and has spent a long time working not only in the thoroughbred industry but specialising in equine practice. So we got a panel that I felt had a good mix of skills and background, and we called for publicly called for submissions. And one thing I think is important to note is just, I guess, I think the panel were all surprised, delighted at the reaction we got. You know, in conversations when we were establishing the group, we sort of, you know, discussed how many submissions we might get, and I think initially, you know, we were hoping to get 50, 60 submissions. We ended up getting 180 submissions from, you know, a wide range of individuals, organisations, a number of the biggest trainers, breeders, owners, all took time to make submissions, as well as each of the PRAs, so that each of the state racing authorities, as well as Racing Australia, all made submissions as well, and a number of welfare groups as well. So the panel certainly had a lot to work with, and I think just the sheer volume of the submissions, I should say Dennis and the panel were very good in that every submission was read by every panel member. So anyone who wanted to make a contribution had that opportunity, and that was, you know, each submission was given significant weight and thought. So really, I think anyone who made the effort was certainly listened to. On top of the submissions, the panel then reached out and had met with more than 60 individuals and organisations, and we're doing this all in the background of the COVID situation, obviously, which made face-to-face meetings difficult. But the flip side of that coin, I suppose, was that it allowed for the panel to meet a great many people in a short space of time, which might not have been possible had we been trying to organise face-to-face meetings. So I think there was benefits in that the group were able to meet those people, or the number of people. But I do think, you know, the dynamics of a Zoom meeting are definitely different, and maybe there's some nuance sometimes that's lost, or a level of engagement. But between the submissions and between the meetings, I think the panel traversed a huge amount of ground, spoke to a real variety, and really developed. I think that work really allowed for the report to be comprehensive. The panel also commissioned a number of pieces of research that they felt would really add depth to their views, or base some of their thoughts, or provide more evidence in different areas. So there were probably 3 or 4 pieces of research that was specifically commissioned by the panel to help them in their findings. And then we had a process, or the panel had a process, I should say. Just to be clear, I'd never attended any of I think I attended one meeting, and that was at the request of the person who was meeting with the panel. The panel met with everyone separately. The panel took all the submissions themselves. They were very much supported by TBA, supporting the process, and and providing admin support. The panel were very much left to their own devices in terms of making their recommendations, making their findings, discussing amongst themselves, and obviously, as you'd expect, there was some, I'm sure, robust discussion, but ultimately, I think what we've ended up with is an incredibly strong report, an incredibly comprehensive report that really provides a great basis for the industry, great guidance for the industry moving forward, to really better secure the welfare of horses, particularly at the end of their career. The report was released towards the end of last November, and I was very pleasantly surprised by how much traction the report got, and by that, so the report was the release of the report was covered on the front page of the Age newspaper in Melbourne. It was given a huge run on page 3 of the Australian. It was on the back page of the Australian as well. It was on the back page of the Herald Sun. As well as that, it was on a number of radio stations across the country, and the press conference on the release of the report was carried by, I think, every commercial TV network, as well as on the ABC, a significant segment on the ABC 7:30. So it was great that it got that traction, but really that, I think should highlight the importance of this work, the interest in this work. People, whether they're supporters of racing or not, are very interested in this subject. They want to know that horses are well cared for. They want to know what the industry is doing about it, and that really just reinforces with me that as an industry, we're under huge scrutiny, and that scrutiny is only going to increase in the future, and therefore we need a clear framework so that we can protect our horses, ensure their welfare, but also be able to publicly demonstrate that we're doing that to the broader community, to politicians, to those who are supporters and those who are opposed to racing. We need that. We need to be able to have that framework and be clear about it, and be very clear about what we are doing. The report, as I say, so it's 140 pages, and there are 46 individual recommendations in the report. So I will just talk to maybe just some of the key elements of the report, and I would then more than happy to take questions. I'm sure Dennis might want to chip in and respond to some of those as well. With those key findings, first of all, I just want to acknowledge the report did say that there is a lot of good work going on. I think it's important to acknowledge that this was never, wasn't meant to be a report. The panel weren't there to just scorecard what's going on at state level. This was about looking at what's already in progress, looking at what's already established, but actually looking far wider than that, and also looking at where are the elements we could improve. So it wasn't about criticizing anyone. It was about acknowledging what worked well, but also looking at where those shortcomings were. And I think, again, just touching on the panel earlier, none of the panel are involved. A couple of the panelists are racehorse owners. Ken, part of his practice involves the thoroughbred industry, but there was no one there on the panel who is a racing industry professional or works for a PRA or works for a racing body. And I think that was important to be able to have that independence, both in terms of coming with a skills base and experience from other industries, but also not having to look out for any particular interest group. They were there to form their opinions and give their opinions as best they could. Running through those sort of key findings, first of all, and I mentioned this first of all because it's the first recommendation in the report. calls on the industry to take responsibility, to take all reasonable steps to ensure the welfare of their horses while racing and after racing. I think that's an important thing. I think most people in the industry would acknowledge that and would accept that responsibility. But nowhere do we formally say that in the industry. So I think that's an important thing. The second element was around national standards. Really, the panel have sought with this report to create, I think it's probably best described as a framework whereby horses are protected from the moment they're born right through till their death, and including how that death occurs. And to do that, you really need to have standards that are enforceable, standards that are a must do rather than should do. So things that you must do, and we need that on a nationally consistent basis. So with those national standards, what the panel really said was that governments need to get together to develop national minimum standards for the care of all horses. So not just thoroughbreds. So that all horses are protected in Australia by minimum standards. At the moment, there are only in Victoria and Tasmania are there standards for the care of all horses. So it's really important that that gets done. That will protect all horses, but of course, it will protect thoroughbreds that leave the industry, because at the moment, as soon as a thoroughbred leaves the industry's ability to ensure the welfare for that horse, the industry has no power or jurisdiction over the care of that horse, and that's really a significant challenge, because you've got horses which are and some of the public research showed this up in terms of, we did some sort of polling, for want of a better expression, and that people see a racehorse. A racehorse might be 15, it might be retired 10 years, 11 years. And if something happens to that horse, in the community's mind, that horse is a racehorse, and it reflects on the racing industry. So that's a real challenge because, as I say, a horse may have left the industry a long time ago, and there is no way of the industry insisting on behaviour or treatment of those horses. So national standards were an absolute sort of essential pillar of a proper welfare framework that protects all horses. We then get to industry standards. The way that the rules of racing are framed, and I should say the rules of racing apply to everyone who's a racing participant, and since 2016 have also applied, the rules relating to welfare have also applied to breeders in the breeding industry. So industry standards, the way they are framed is very much, we don't have minimum standards. We have the ability to essentially punish people who mistreat animals, but we don't have mandated standards. Now, the panel found that for the overwhelming majority of horses, they're well cared for within the industry. But the panel's view also was that it was important that the minimum standards of care for horses should be communicated to everyone in the industry. And if people don't meet those standards, they shouldn't be in the industry. And that's certainly something that the TBA support wholeheartedly. So developing those industry standards would also send a clear message, not just to the participants in the industry, but also to the community, that this is an industry that cares about its horses. We're going to set a high standard of care, a high minimum standard. And the panel's view was very much that whatever the national standards for horses, however they were set, that the industry standards must be significantly higher than those. One of the other key elements of the report is around traceability. And I mentioned this just at the start, saying, the 730 report really asked some uncomfortable questions of the industry. And one of those was, what happens to our horses once they leave? And really the only honest answer to that is we don't know, or we don't know well enough, because we don't have the data. So there's been lots of efforts to go to try and make sure that the industry is aware of what happens to horses, and lots of great programs in terms of encouraging people to update their data and Racing to Victoria have built a database for exactly that, for people who take thoroughbreds after their career's finished. But without knowing what happens to our horses, I think the industry is always going to be a really significant. We're not going to be able to provide the level of information that I think is going to be expected from us in the future, and that's to know what happens to our horses. So the panel's view is that there needs to be traceability system set up whereby each horse is individually identified, its owner identified, and its location identified. We have traceability for other animals, but we don't have it for horses at the moment. So a clear recommendation there. Now, as I'm sure many of you are aware, that there is a traceability working group. There was a report done by the Australian Senate into this issue. So there is definitely work afoot, and it's certainly my hope that working group comes up with a system whereby all horses, not just thoroughbreds, but all horses, their location, their owner is identified, so that we can actually have the proper data we need. With transition, clearly when a horse leaves the industry is a really, really crucial period in that horse's life. And the panel spoke to lots of owners, lots of trainers, and a view they came to was that there was really a need to better assist that transition. And that can be done by a number of ways. First of all, increasing resources to promote ownership of thoroughbreds. So there's a lot of good programs going on, whether that's sponsorship of show classes, whether it's sponsoring riding groups that use thoroughbreds, whether it's putting on educational programs to help people who have thoroughbreds. But really there was a great need to stimulate demand for the thoroughbred, to help educate new owners on how to care for them, and also to help create better pathways for horses when they leave, because a number of the submissions said, and there was a lot of rehomers and retrainers that made submissions as well, that there was a lack sometimes of knowledge from people within the industry. They didn't maybe have all the contacts to be able to point their horse in the right direction, or find a suitable home. So getting that first home out of racing right was crucial to the long-term welfare outcome for horses. So the industry needs to do more, and some of that will be financial resources, some of that will be providing more admin support to help transition those horses. A really interesting recommendation, and there's a chapter on it in the report, is around a safety net. So one of the groups that the panel met with was ROR in the UK, and they're the leading racehorse charity, Aftercare charity in the UK. And one of the things that they do is run a program whereby anyone who has a thoroughbred which they can no longer care for, or a thoroughbred that they are concerned about its welfare, can call them up, and they've got a network of vets across the country or across the UK, and they will go assess that horse, and will take that horse. If that horse requires to be, if the best outcome for that horse is to be put down, that they will fund that horse being euthanized. But if not, they'll take that horse and put available money to ensure that horse is cared for a year, with a view that the people caring for it do their best to transition it into another home. And it really allows for the industry to say, we're serious about caring for our horses. Horses that we can't always know what's going to happen to every horse, but we're going to put in place a safety net so that those horses, there is a mechanism there. Our horses don't have to go to an abattoir, don't have to go to a knackery. We will, as a minimum, ensure that they have a humane death. So that safety net works well in the UK, and I think it would work well here in Australia. And I think it would be a really powerful way for the industry to really step up and ensure that those horses that have left the industry, that maybe are in really difficult circumstances, that the industry is there to support them. And finally, just one of the other key points is around a national body. This had overwhelming support from industry participants. And there's some sort of telling quotes in the report from really senior people in the industry that they felt that welfare was such importance. It was crucial that the industry come together to have a forum to discuss better outcomes, to look at policy, to drive some key reforms across the country. One of the things that's I guess the panel were certainly agreed on this, and I think almost every submission was that we have a national industry. The way it's run is state-based and has its challenges, but we have a national industry, and something that happens in one state will impact on another state. And we saw that with the 730 report. I think almost all of the worst footage from that show was from Queensland, but of course it impacts the reputation of the industry nationally. So we need to make sure that no state is left behind, no state is left doesn't have the funds to make sure that they can adequately provide that support for horses leaving the industry. So this national body is needed. It would have certainly have independent people on that board. But one thing it's not, I don't think that the design of the board is going to be up for the industry to decide if they want to do that and exactly what its remit would be. But I don't think the panel ever envisaged that it would tell PRAs they must do this or they must do that. The one policy they said really should be rolled out nationally was the safety net for obvious reasons. But this is about driving better reform, driving best practice, ensuring, as I say, that no state is left behind. And also, there's a couple of elements in the report around ways of improving standards within the industry. Quality assurance schemes have worked so well in other animal industries, and there's certainly a view of the panel that they could work well. And that's something that a national body could establish and run those QA schemes for participants. So whether that's for breeders, whether that's for retrainers or rehomers, those QA schemes I think could be a really valuable tool and would rightfully sit with a national body. Just touching very briefly on, I guess, the where to from here. I've received a huge amount of support from the racing authorities, from racing ministers, from agricultural ministers, from governments across the country, as well as the federal government. We'll be looking at how we can work with all of those groups to roll these recommendations out, and I think there'll be some developments in the coming weeks in that space around getting people together to actually push this through. Inevitably there'll be some recommendations that are harder to get up than others, but I think it would be really crucial that we create that framework so that we have enforceable standards for horses from birth right through to death. So I hope I'm not sure how long I've spoken there, but I hope that gives a bit of an understanding of how the report came about, the work that went into it, and some of the key elements of the findings.